Imagine waking up one day and feeling like your life is quietly falling apart, not in some dramatic, movie-like explosion, but in subtle, unsettling ways that you can't quite explain. Plans you were so certain about suddenly start slipping through your fingers. People you thought would always be there begin to drift away without warning, and the version of you that once felt so clear now feels distant, almost unrecognizable. And here's the strange part. It doesn't feel random, it feels intentional, almost as if something unseen is rearranging the pieces of your life behind the scenes, and you're left standing there wondering what you did wrong, questioning every decision, every step, every belief you've ever held. But what if I told you that in moments like these, when everything seems to be breaking, you're not actually losing control? You're being tested, and not in the way you've been taught to think about tests. Not like pass or fail, not like success or failure, but something far deeper, something that most people go through without ever realizing what's really happening. Because on the surface, it just looks like chaos, like bad luck, like life turning against you. But underneath, there's a pattern, a hidden sequence that only reveals itself if you're willing to look beyond what's obvious. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because the universe doesn't test you when you're ready. It tests you when you think you're about to break, right before something in your reality is about to shift, right before a new version of your life begins to form. And most people, they miss it. They assume they're being punished. They assume they've failed somehow. So they react from fear, from doubt, from confusion, and without realizing it, they lock themselves back into the same reality they were trying to escape. But there's another way to see this, a way that changes everything. Because what if these moments, the confusion, the isolation, the pressure, are not signs that you're off track, but proof that you're closer than you've ever been, closer to a different life, a different version of yourself, one that requires you to think, feel, and respond in a completely new way. And that's exactly what this video is about. Not motivation, not surface-level advice, but the hidden mechanism behind why your life seems to fall apart right before it transforms. And if you've ever felt like something deeper is happening in your life that you can't explain, then you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to the Inner Code. And if this kind of content speaks to something inside you, take a second to subscribe, because what we're about to explore might completely change how you see everything that's happening to you right now, and more importantly, what it actually means. And if you stay with that idea for just a moment, something begins to shift in how you interpret your own life. Because what once felt like random disruption starts to feel more like a pattern that has been quietly repeating itself. Moments where things did not work out no matter how hard you tried. Times when you felt pushed out of situations you thought were right for you. Or when everything you depended on suddenly became unstable. And at the time, you probably labeled those moments as mistakes or bad timing. Maybe even failure. But looking back now, there is a strange consistency in how those moments show up. Almost like they follow a sequence. First the discomfort, then the confusion, then the sense that something is ending before you fully understand why. And here is where most people misunderstand what is happening. Because they assume that if something feels wrong, it must be wrong. If something is difficult, it must mean they are off track. But what if difficulty is not a sign of misalignment? What if it is the very mechanism that reveals it? Because when everything is easy, you do not question your state. You do not examine your patterns. You do not see the hidden beliefs that are shaping your experience. But when pressure is applied, when things begin to crack, suddenly everything that was invisible becomes impossible to ignore. Your reactions, your fears, your attachments, the way you interpret situations, all of it rises to the surface, and it is uncomfortable, not because something is broken, but because something is being exposed, and that exposure is not there to punish you. It is there to show you exactly where you still operate from an old version of yourself, a version that cannot exist in the reality you are moving toward. And this is the part that changes everything. Because instead of asking why is this happening to me, you begin to ask what is this revealing about me? And that question alone shifts you out of resistance and into awareness. Because the universe does not need to fight you to change your reality. It only needs to reveal the parts of you that are not aligned with where you are going. And once you see them, you are faced with a choice to hold on to what is familiar or to let it fall away even if it feels like losing a part of yourself. And that is why these moments feel so intense, because they are not just external situations, They are internal confrontations, moments where you come face to face with the version of yourself that created your current reality. And whether you realize it or not, every reaction you have in these moments is shaping what comes next, not in some abstract or distant way, but in a very immediate and direct sense. Because the way you interpret what is happening determines the state you enter, and the state you enter determines the reality you align with. So what feels like chaos is actually a mirror, reflecting back to you the exact patterns that must change before anything new can take their place. And once you begin to see it this way, you realize that nothing is randomly falling apart. It is being rearranged in a way that forces you to see what you could not see before. And whether that becomes a breakdown or a breakthrough depends entirely on how you choose to respond in the moments when everything feels uncertain. And if everything you are experiencing is revealing something deeper within you, then the real question is not why it is happening, but whether you are willing to see what it is actually trying to show you. Because here is the part that most people never consider. What if nothing in your life is going wrong? What if the discomfort, the uncertainty, even the loss is not evidence of failure, but evidence that something old is being dismantled on purpose? And I know how strange that sounds. Because we are conditioned to believe that stability means we are on the right path and disruption means something is off. But if you look closely at the most transformative moments in your life, they never began with clarity. They began with confusion, with things not making sense, with doors closing that you were certain would open. And at the time it felt like resistance, like something was blocking you. But what if it was not resistance at all? What if it was redirection? And even more than that, what if it was preparation? Because a new reality cannot exist on top of an old foundation. It requires space. It requires the removal of patterns, identities, and attachments that are no longer aligned. And that process does not feel gentle. It feels like something is being taken away from you, when, in reality, it is being cleared for something you cannot yet see. And this is where the illusion becomes so convincing. Because your mind tries to make sense of the situation using your past, using what is familiar, so it labels the experience as loss, as failure, as something to fix or avoid. But the deeper truth is that not everything that feels like loss is meant to be recovered. Some things are meant to end because they belong to a version of you that you are no longer becoming, and holding on to them only delays what is trying to emerge. And this is the moment where everything shifts, not externally, but internally, because you begin to realize that the discomfort is not a signal to go back. It is a signal to let go. And that realization is not easy, because letting go feels like stepping into the unknown without any guarantee. It feels like giving up control at the exact moment you want it the most. But that is exactly why this phase exists, because it is not testing your ability to control your life. It is testing your willingness to release control of what no longer fits. And this is the hidden layer that most people never reach, because they spend all their energy trying to fix what is falling apart instead of asking whether it is meant to stay at all. And the moment you stop trying to force things back into place, something subtle begins to happen. You create space, not just externally, but within your own state of being. And in that space, something new has the opportunity to take form, something that was not possible before. And it does not arrive all at once. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it is there, waiting for you to fully release what is no longer yours so it can become what is. And once you begin to sense that something new is quietly trying to take form within that space you have created, you start to realize that what you are experiencing is not random at all, but part of a much deeper system that operates whether you are aware of it or not. Because reality itself is not just a collection of events happening around you. It is a reflection of the state you consistently embody. And this is where things take a turn that most people are not ready to hear, because it means that what you are moving into is not determined by what you want, but by who you are being when everything around you feels uncertain. And this is exactly where the test exists, not in the situation itself, but in your response to it. Because two people can go through the exact same experience, the same loss, the same confusion, the same disruption, and yet walk away with completely different outcomes. Not because their circumstances were different, but because their internal state was different. One reacts from fear, tries to control, tries to force things back into place, clings to what is familiar, and in doing so, recreates the same reality again, while the other pauses, observes, allows, and chooses to respond from a place that is not dictated by the past. And in that moment, something shifts, not visibly at first, but fundamentally, because the state they are in no longer matches the old pattern. And when your state changes, your reality has no choice but to reorganize itself around that new state. And this is the mechanism that most people never see. They think reality changes first, and then they will feel different. But it is the opposite. You feel different first, you become different first, and then reality follows. And that is why the pressure increases right before the shift. Because it is the only way to reveal whether you are truly ready to embody something new, or if you will fall back into what is comfortable. And this is where it becomes personal. Because it is not about understanding this intellectually. It is about who you are in the exact moment when things are not going your way, when nothing makes sense, when you feel like you are losing grip, because that moment reveals everything. It reveals your default patterns, your unconscious reactions, the beliefs you did not even know you were carrying, and more importantly, it gives you a choice, not a loud or obvious one, but a quiet internal decision, to either react the way you always have, or to step into a different way of being, even if it feels unfamiliar, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it feels like you are standing on unstable ground. And this is why it feels like a test, not because something external is judging you, but because your own state is being brought to the surface so clearly that you can no longer ignore it. And in that clarity, you are given the opportunity to choose differently. And that choice, more than anything else, is what determines the version of reality you step into next. And if that quiet internal choice is what truly determines the reality you step into, then the next question becomes even more unsettling, because it forces you to look at your life in a way you probably never have before. What if every disruption you are experiencing right now is not just revealing your current state, but actively preparing you for a different one? Because there is a phase that almost nobody talks about, a phase where everything begins to feel unstable, not because it is falling apart, but because it can no longer support the version of you that is emerging. And this is where the real process begins, not the visible change, not the external results, but the internal shift that happens when your old identity starts to lose its grip. And at first it is subtle. You notice that things that once excited you no longer feel the same. Conversations feel empty, environments feel draining. Routines that once gave you comfort now feel restrictive, and you cannot explain why. Because nothing on the outside has dramatically changed, but something inside you has, and this creates a tension that is difficult to describe, because you are no longer fully connected to your past, but you have not yet stepped into your future. You are in between, in a space where clarity has not yet formed, but the old structure is already dissolving. And this is where most people panic, because this in-between space feels like being lost, like having no direction, no solid ground to stand on. But what if this space is not a mistake? What if it is a necessary phase that allows a new version of you to take shape without being pulled back by what you used to be? Because as long as your old identity feels stable, you will keep returning to it, even if it no longer serves you. And that is why this phase feels so uncomfortable, because it removes that stability. It removes the certainty you once relied on. And in doing so, it forces you to confront a deeper question: who are you when everything familiar is no longer there to define you? And this is where the preparation truly happens, not through external action, but through internal redefinition. Because before your reality can change, your identity has to shift, and identity is not something you can simply decide overnight. It is something that is reshaped through moments of uncertainty, through experiences that challenge how you see yourself, through situations that push you out of your default responses. And this is why the process feels so personal, because it is not just about what is happening around you. It is about what is changing within you, the way you think, the way you interpret, the way you respond. All of it is being recalibrated. And even though it feels like you are losing parts of yourself, what is actually happening is that you are being separated from patterns that no longer match the reality you are moving toward. And this separation is not gentle, it is not comfortable, but it is precise. It removes exactly what cannot come with you, and leaves you in a state where something new can begin to form, even if you cannot fully see it yet. And this is the phase where you begin to understand that the test is not about proving your strength. It is about allowing your transformation, even when you do not yet recognize the person you are becoming. And if this transformation is not about proving your strength, but allowing yourself to become someone new, then the first real test begins in a place most people overlook, because it does not look like a test at all. It looks like everything in your life suddenly slipping out of your control. Plans that once felt certain no longer hold. Timelines you trusted begin to fall apart. And no matter how much effort you put in, things refuse to align the way they used to. And this is where frustration starts to build, because you have been taught that effort should equal results, that control should bring stability. But in this phase, that equation breaks completely, and it feels like nothing you do is working, like you are pushing against something invisible that keeps redirecting you. And this is the moment where most people react instinctively. They try harder, they grip tighter, they force outcomes, believing that more control will restore order. But what if this is exactly the response that keeps them stuck? Because this phase is not designed to reward control, it is designed to expose your dependence on it. And that realization can be uncomfortable, because control has been your way of feeling safe, of creating predictability, of managing uncertainty. But here, control becomes the very thing that blocks the shift, because the reality you are moving toward requires a different state, one that is not built on forcing outcomes, but on allowing alignment. And this is where the test becomes clear, not externally, but internally, because you are being placed in situations where control is no longer effective, where your usual strategies do not work, where the only thing left is your ability to respond without trying to dominate the outcome. And that is not easy, because letting go of control feels like stepping into chaos, like giving up the one thing that made you feel grounded. But what you begin to notice, if you stay present long enough, is that not everything is actually falling apart. It is just no longer following your old expectations. And there is a difference between the two, because falling apart implies loss, while redirection implies movement. And this is where a subtle shift begins to happen, because instead of asking how do I fix this, you begin to ask where is this leading me? And that question opens a completely different perspective, one where you are no longer fighting the process, but observing it. And in that observation, you start to see patterns, moments where things did not work out in one direction, only to guide you towards something you would not have chosen consciously. And this is where trust begins to replace control, not blind trust, not passive acceptance, but a deeper awareness that there is something unfolding beyond your immediate understanding. And the more you resist it, the more tension you create. But the more you allow it, the more clarity begins to emerge. And this is the essence of the first test, not whether you can control your reality, but whether you can release the need to control it long enough to let a new one take shape. Because the moment you stop forcing what no longer fits, you create space for what actually does, and that space is where the shift begins. And as you begin to create that space by releasing the need to control everything, something even more unexpected starts to happen. Because the second phase does not come in the form of events, it comes through people, through relationships that once felt stable suddenly becoming distant, misaligned, or completely out of sync with who you are becoming. And this is where it gets deeply personal, because it is one thing to lose control over plans or outcomes, but it is something entirely different to feel like you are losing connection with the people who once made you feel grounded, understood, or even safe. And at first you might try to explain it. Maybe they have changed, maybe you have changed, maybe it is just a phase. But no matter how much you try to bring things back to what they used to be, something feels off, like you are no longer speaking the same language, like there is an invisible distance that did not exist before. And this creates a kind of quiet loneliness that is hard to describe, because you can be surrounded by the same people, in the same places, doing the same things, and yet feel completely disconnected. And this is where many people begin to doubt themselves. They wonder if they are overthinking, if they are pulling away unnecessarily, if they are the problem. But what if this disconnection is not a mistake? What if it is a reflection of something much deeper happening within you? Because as your internal state shifts, as your perception changes, as your awareness expands, the dynamics that once felt natural may no longer resonate. Not because anyone is wrong, but because you are no longer aligned in the same way. And this is the part that is rarely talked about, because growth is often presented as something exciting, something empowering, but it also comes with separation, with the realization that not everything and not everyone can come with you into the next phase of your life. And that realization can feel heavy, because it forces you to let go not just of situations, but of connections that once defined a part of who you were. And this is where the test becomes even more subtle, because it is not about pushing people away or making drastic decisions. It is about whether you can accept the shift without forcing things to stay the same, without holding on out of fear, without trying to recreate a version of connection that no longer fits who you are becoming. And that is not easy, because there is comfort in familiarity, in shared history, in the known. But holding on to that comfort can keep you anchored in a version of yourself that is already dissolving. And the moment you begin to allow the space between you and others to exist without resistance, something changes, not necessarily in them, but in you. You begin to stand more firmly in your own state, less dependent on external validation, less defined by external relationships, and more connected to something internal that is still forming. And this is where the loneliness begins to transform, not into isolation, but into clarity, because in that space, you start to see yourself more clearly, without the noise of expectations, without the influence of who you used to be around certain people. And this is the second test, not whether others will stay or leave, but whether you can remain aligned with yourself even when everything familiar around you begins to shift. Because the more you try to hold on to what is no longer aligned, the more resistance you create. But the more you allow the shift to happen naturally, the more you open yourself to connections, environments, and experiences that match who you are becoming, even if you cannot fully see them yet. And just when you begin to find some sense of stability within that solitude, something shifts again, because the next phase does not just test your ability to let go of control or detach from what no longer aligns. It begins to challenge something even deeper, your sense of identity itself, because there comes a point in this process where it is no longer about what is happening around you, or even who is in your life. It becomes about how you see yourself at your core, and this is where things can feel the most disorienting, because the version of you that once felt so clear starts to dissolve in subtle but undeniable ways. You might notice that your reactions are changing. Things that once triggered you no longer have the same effect. Or sometimes the opposite happens. You feel more sensitive, more aware, more affected by things you used to ignore, and it creates this strange internal tension where you no longer feel like the person you used to be, but you also do not fully recognize who you are becoming. And this in-between state can feel like a loss of identity, like you are drifting without a solid sense of self. And for many people, this is where doubt becomes overwhelming. Because if you do not know who you are, how can you trust where you are going? And the instinct here is to try to rebuild a sense of identity quickly, to define yourself again, to cling to labels, roles, or patterns that once gave you a sense of certainty. But this is exactly where the process asks something different from you. It asks you to remain in the unknown a little longer, to resist the urge to define yourself prematurely, because what is dissolving is not your true self. It is the version of you that was shaped by past experiences, expectations, and limitations. And that version cannot exist in the reality you are moving toward, and this is why it feels like everything is being stripped away, because in a sense, it is, but not in a destructive way, in a revealing way. Because when all the layers that you used to identify with begin to fall away, what remains is something much more authentic, something that is not based on external validation or past conditioning, but something that emerges naturally when you stop trying to be who you think you should be. And this is the deeper test, not whether you can hold on to an identity, but whether you can allow it to evolve, whether you can sit in the discomfort of not knowing who you are for a period of time, trusting that clarity will come not from forcing it, but from allowing it to unfold. And this requires a level of patience and self-trust that most people are not used to, because it goes against everything you have been taught about certainty and control. But if you can stay in this space without rushing to fill it, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to notice that your sense of self is no longer tied to specific outcomes, roles, or external circumstances. It becomes more fluid, more grounded internally rather than externally. And from that place, your decisions begin to change, not because you are trying to create a new identity, but because you are naturally acting from a different state of being. And this is where the shift begins to solidify, not through force, not through effort, but through alignment. Because when your identity changes at its core, your reality cannot remain the same. It has to adjust. It has to reorganize itself around who you are now. And that is why this phase feels so intense. Because it is not just about change, it is about becoming someone you have never been before, even if that someone has always been within you waiting to emerge. And just as your identity begins to loosen its old definitions and reshape itself into something more authentic, there comes a moment where the process reaches its most intense point, because this is where the illusion of stability completely disappears, and you are faced with something that feels deeply unsettling, a sense that you are no longer certain about anything, not your path, not your decisions, not even yourself. And this is where the third phase begins, the phase where doubt rises to the surface in a way that feels almost overwhelming, because it does not just question what you are doing, it questions who you are becoming. And this is where many people turn back, not because they cannot move forward, but because the uncertainty feels too heavy to carry, because when you can no longer rely on your past identity, when your external reality has not yet caught up with your internal shift, you are left in a space where nothing feels fully solid. And in that space, doubt finds its way in. It whispers that maybe you are wrong, maybe you are overthinking, maybe you are losing direction, and those thoughts feel real, not because they are true, but because they are familiar. They come from the part of you that is trying to return to what it knows, to what feels safe, even if it no longer serves you. And this is where the test becomes the most invisible, because it is no longer about what is happening around you. It is about what is happening within you. It is about whether you believe your old fears or trust your new awareness. And that choice is not loud or dramatic. It happens quietly, in the way you interpret your own thoughts, in whether you give power to doubt or simply observe it without attaching to it. And that is not easy, because doubt feels convincing. It presents itself as logic, as caution, as realism. But underneath, it is simply the echo of your old identity, trying to maintain control. And if you follow it, you will find yourself slowly reconstructing the same patterns, the same decisions, the same reality you were beginning to move beyond. But if you can pause, if you can recognize that this doubt is not a signal to turn back, but a sign that you are moving beyond your previous limitations, something begins to shift, because you stop reacting to every thought as if it defines you. You begin to see that not every feeling is a command, not every uncertainty is a warning. And in that awareness, you create distance between who you are and what you experience. And that distance gives you something you did not have before: choice. The ability to move forward not because you feel completely certain, but because you no longer need certainty to take a step. And this is where the process transforms from something that is happening to you into something you are actively participating in, because you are no longer waiting for clarity before you move. You are moving in a way that creates clarity, and that shift changes everything, because it breaks the cycle of needing external confirmation before trusting yourself, and replaces it with a deeper sense of alignment that does not depend on immediate results. And this is why this phase feels so intense, because it is not just testing your resilience. It is testing your self-trust at the deepest level. Whether you can continue forward even when your mind tries to pull you back. Whether you can stay aligned with what you feel is true even when nothing around you confirms it yet. And this is where the final layer begins to form, not in the absence of doubt, but in your ability to move beyond it without losing yourself. And if you can move forward without needing certainty, even while doubt still echoes in the background, then you arrive at a point where something becomes undeniably clear, not through logic, but through experience, because you begin to see that everything you went through was not random. It was structured. It followed a pattern that only reveals itself once you reach the other side of it. And this is where the final realization begins to unfold, because what once felt like separate struggles, loss of control, disconnection, identity confusion, doubt, now starts to connect into a single sequence, a process that was never meant to break you, but to reshape you step by step. And this is the moment where the illusion finally cracks, because you realize that the universe was never testing your ability to survive those moments. It was testing your ability to become someone who no longer reacts the same way within them. And that is a completely different perspective, because it means the goal was never to fix your external situation. It was to shift your internal state so deeply that your external reality would have no choice but to reflect it. And when you see it this way, something changes permanently, because you stop looking at challenges as obstacles and begin to recognize them as checkpoints. Moments designed to reveal whether you are still operating from your old patterns or if you have truly moved beyond them. And this is where the process becomes almost precise. Because each phase you went through was not random. It targeted something specific: your need for control, your attachment to familiar connections, your dependence on identity, your reaction to doubt. And each time those elements were brought to the surface, you were given the opportunity to respond differently, not perfectly, but consciously. And that is what created the shift, not one big decision, but a series of small internal choices made in moments when it would have been easier to fall back into what you already knew. And this is why the change in your reality often feels delayed, because it is not responding to what you want. It is responding to who you consistently are. And consistency is not built in comfort. It is built in pressure, in moments where your default reactions are triggered and you choose something different anyway. And this is the hidden mechanism that most people never see. They expect change to happen when everything feels right, when they are confident, when they are certain. But real change happens when none of those conditions are present, when you are uncertain, when you are uncomfortable, when nothing around you confirms that you are on the right path, and you continue anyway, not because you are sure, but because something deeper within you no longer aligns with going back. And this is where the process reveals its true purpose, because it was never about testing your limits. It was about dissolving them, removing the boundaries that were created by your past patterns, your conditioned responses, your inherited beliefs. And once those boundaries begin to dissolve, your reality is no longer constrained in the same way. It becomes more fluid, more responsive, more aligned with your current state rather than your past identity. And this is why the shift often feels sudden from the outside. But from your perspective, it feels earned, not through effort, but through transformation, because you know what you had to release, what you had to face, what you had to move through to get there. And in that understanding, something settles within you. A quiet recognition that what once felt like chaos was actually a process, unfolding with precision, guiding you not to a different place, but to a different version of yourself that was always waiting beneath everything you thought you were. And once that quiet recognition settles in, once you truly see that nothing you went through was accidental, something even deeper begins to emerge. Because you start to realize that the real test was never about the events themselves. It was about the state you chose to hold while moving through them. And this is where everything becomes unmistakably clear, because you begin to notice that the same external situation can produce entirely different outcomes depending on how you respond to it internally. And this is not just a theory anymore. It is something you have lived through, because there were moments where you reacted from fear and everything seemed to tighten, to repeat, to pull you back into the same patterns. And there were other moments, even small ones, where you paused, where you chose not to react the same way, and something subtle shifted, something opened, something moved differently. And that difference, as small as it may have seemed at the time, is what created the separation between your old reality and the one you are stepping into now. And this is the part that changes how you see everything moving forward. Because you stop waiting for the outside world to validate your internal state, and instead you begin to understand that your internal state is what gives meaning to everything you experience. It is what determines whether something becomes a setback or a redirection, whether something feels like loss or like release. And this awareness gives you a kind of clarity that is not dependent on circumstances, because even when things are uncertain, even when outcomes are not guaranteed, you begin to trust the way you are moving through it. And that trust is not blind. It is built from experience. From seeing how each moment of alignment, no matter how small, created a ripple that eventually changed the direction of your path. And this is where the process stops feeling like something you are trying to understand and starts feeling like something you are embodying. Because you are no longer analyzing every situation, trying to figure out what it means. You are living it from a place of awareness, responding in a way that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you have been. And that shift removes a kind of internal conflict that most people do not even realize they are carrying. The constant need to control, to predict, to ensure that everything is going according to plan. And in its place, there is a quieter state, one that does not resist uncertainty but moves with it, not passively, but intentionally, because you are no longer reacting to what is happening, You are participating in it from a different level of consciousness. And this is where the test reveals its final layer, because it is no longer about whether you can recognize what is happening. It is about whether you can remain in this new state consistently, not just when things are easy, but especially when they are not. Because consistency is what stabilizes the shift. It is what allows your new state to become your natural way of being, rather than something you return to only in moments of clarity. And this is where the process becomes complete, not because everything is suddenly perfect, but because you are no longer dependent on perfection to feel aligned. And in that alignment, your reality begins to reflect something entirely different, not because you forced it to change, but because you changed in a way that made the old version of your reality no longer sustainable. And that is when you understand, not intellectually, but deeply, that the universe was never testing your limits. It was guiding you into a version of yourself that could hold the reality you once thought was out of reach. And once you reach that level of alignment, where you are no longer reacting from your past, but responding from who you are becoming, you arrive at a point where everything narrows down to a single, defining moment, a moment that does not look extraordinary from the outside, but carries more weight than anything that came before it. Because this is where the choice becomes real, not theoretical, not something you think about, but something you live through in real time. Because even after everything you have seen, everything you have understood, there will still be moments where the old patterns try to pull you back, where familiar thoughts, familiar reactions, familiar fears resurface. And in those moments, nothing external will tell you what to do. There will be no clear sign, no confirmation, no reassurance that you are on the right path. And this is where the process reaches its most subtle point. Because the shift does not depend on what is happening around you. It depends entirely on what you choose within you. And that choice is simple, but not easy. It is the choice between reacting the way you always have or responding in a way that aligns with who you are becoming. And the difference between those two choices is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, almost invisible. It is choosing not to engage in a thought that would have consumed you before. It is choosing to stay present when your instinct is to escape. It is choosing to trust even when there is no immediate evidence. And these small moments, as insignificant as they may seem, are where the shift is actually decided, not in big breakthroughs, but in consistent, conscious responses that reinforce your new state. And this is why the process can feel so intense. Because it requires you to act from a place that has not yet been fully validated by your external reality. It asks you to embody a version of yourself before you can see the results of that embodiment. And that requires a kind of internal commitment that most people are not used to, because it means you cannot rely on external proof to guide you. You have to rely on something deeper, something that does not fluctuate with circumstances. And this is where the final layer of the test reveals itself. Because it is not testing your knowledge. It is not testing your awareness. It is testing your consistency, whether you can remain aligned with your new state, even when it would be easier to fall back into what is familiar, whether you can continue choosing differently not just once, but repeatedly, until it becomes natural, until it becomes who you are rather than something you are trying to be. And this is where the shift begins to stabilize, because reality does not respond to temporary changes. It responds to sustained states. And once your internal state becomes consistent, once your reactions, your perceptions, your choices all begin to reflect the same level of awareness, your external reality starts to reorganize itself in a way that matches that consistency. Not instantly, not all at once, but in a way that becomes undeniable over time. And this is where you realize that the process was never about reaching a single moment of transformation. It was about becoming someone who naturally lives from that transformed state. Because once that happens, the change in your reality is no longer something you have to chase. It becomes something that unfolds as a direct reflection of who you are. And in that unfolding, the question is no longer whether your reality will change, but how far it will evolve based on the state you choose to maintain. And as this new state becomes something you no longer have to think about, but something you naturally live from, you begin to see your entire journey in a completely different light, because what once felt like a series of confusing, painful, and unpredictable events now reveals itself as a precise unfolding that was shaping you into someone capable of holding a different reality. And in that realization, Something inside you settles in a way it never has before, not because everything is perfect, but because you finally understand that nothing was meaningless. Every moment of loss, every phase of uncertainty, every time you felt disconnected or unsure of yourself was not there to break you. It was there to strip away everything that was not truly you, so that what remains is something real, something stable, something that does not depend on circumstances to exist. And this is the deeper lesson that most people spend their entire lives trying to understand, that your reality is not something you chase. It is something that reflects who you are being. And when you truly grasp that, even at a small level, it changes how you move through your life right now. Because instead of waiting for the perfect conditions, instead of waiting for clarity or confidence or external validation, you begin to focus on something much more powerful, the way you respond in this moment, the way you choose to interpret what is happening, the way you show up even when things are uncertain. And this is where the application becomes real, because it is not about doing something extreme or completely changing your life overnight. It is about the small, consistent shifts in how you think, how you feel, and how you act. It is choosing to pause instead of reacting, choosing to observe instead of assuming, choosing to trust instead of falling back into fear. And these choices may seem small, but they are exactly what reshapes your internal state. And over time, that internal state reshapes your external reality in ways that you could not have predicted. And this is where you realize that you are not waiting for your life to change. You are participating in that change every single day through the state you choose to hold. And the more consistent you become with that, the more natural it feels. Until one day you look around and realize that your reality has shifted in ways that once felt impossible, not because you forced it, but because you became someone who could naturally experience it. And that is the quiet power behind everything you have gone through. Not something dramatic or sudden, but something deeply transformative that unfolds over time and becomes undeniable once you see it. So here is something I want you to think about. What is one situation in your life right now where you can choose to respond differently instead of reacting the way you always have? Take a moment and share your answer in the comments, because your perspective might help someone else see their own situation in a new way. And if this video gave you clarity or made you see your journey differently, consider subscribing to The Inner Code, because there is so much more to explore and your support helps keep these conversations going.